Airplanes have been around for more than a century. Everyone loves and uses aircraft daily. There are many kinds of uses for aircraft, everything from keeping the skies safe in fighter jets to transporting people and goods to where they need to go. In 2016 alone, almost 700 million passengers flew on different airlines. But where did planes originate and how did they develop into what they are today? We need to think back to the first idea of flight, the first object that humanity could keep in the air: kites. Kites are believed to have been around for almost 2,000 years. They are believed to have originated in China. As soon as kites were created, people experimented and found many different uses for them. One such man was a general named Han Xin of the Han Dynasty, who flew a kite over a city wall he had to get around in order to take the city inside the walls. The kite measured the distance his men needed to tunnel under the city to get around the defenses. His plan worked, and he was able to take the city in the midst of a very surprised enemy. As kites were developed, new ideas for kites were created. Marco Polo was one of the first people to document how to construct and fly a kite. Kites became very popular for entertainment during the 16th century. They were very popular as toys for children. Later in the 18th century, kites began to be used for science. Kites were not only important in predicting weather and proving that lightning was in fact electricity, it also helped in designing the first gliders and aircraft. It was especially useful in the Wright brothers' experiments on the first powered flights. As the idea of human flight took hold, gliders began to be designed and flown to some extent. Early balloonists had also inspired a handful of daring people to attempt flight. Briton George Cayley, born 1773 and died 1857, was one of these inspired few who experimented with heavier-than-air flight. One of his experiments helped the discovery of different wing angles. Another such inventor was named Otto Lilienthal from Germany. He built more than 2,000 gliders and attempted one powered flight, but it was never successful. He later died in a crash with one of his gliders on August 9th, 1896. Oliver and Wilbur Wright were also inspired to create gliders. They had experience in building through a bicycle shop that they owned. They also built and flew kites as part of their tests for their aircraft. Putting this experience together allowed the Wright brothers to experiment with fully sized gliders. After riding with the U.S. Weather Bureau, they found a spot called Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, to begin testing and experimenting with their gliders. It was a very secluded area where not many people lived at or visited. It had plenty of space and had mostly low wind speeds. It was the perfect place to begin experimenting. From 1900 to 1901, they worked on and tweaked their glider. Every winter they would return home and then come back in the spring. After arriving back to Kitty Hawk in 1902, they assembled their glider and prepared for takeoff. After they reached their launch point in Kill Devil Hills, the Wright brothers, with the assistance of a neighbor, launched their aircraft. They flew better than expected and began to break and set new records in that time of aviation. They flew their plane almost 1,000 times that summer and fall. Soon, the Wright brothers would begin to test powered flight. The next year, 1903, they returned to Kitty Hawk once again. They reassembled their glider from the previous year and mounted an engine in the center of the plane. Once again, they headed to their start location, with another helpful neighbor, in Kill Devil Hills. They used a portable battery to start the engine, and then sent their aircraft down a launch rail. It took off and rose 40 feet, and after flying 100 feet, landed back down on the ground. The powered glider flew, but the Wright brothers both agreed that this was not a successful attempt, but they did feel that they were close to the first powered flight. After making some repairs and tweaks to their aircraft, they tried again. With around 400 spectators watching, they started the engine. When the aircraft was just 2/3 down the flight rail, when it took off and flew 120 feet. It was then safely landed and flew 3 more times during that day. The longest flight lasted almost a minute and covered 852 feet. Unfortunately, on their final flight, a wind gust flipped the plane and caused extensive damage to their aircraft. It never would fly again, but it would be given the name Kitty Hawk Flyer. After the Wright brothers demonstrated their design in Europe, aviation plans and ideas took off. Inventors all over the world began designing and flying powered aircraft. A new idea for entertainment was also created. Inventors would compare their designs, and soon it would escalate to aircraft races around the country. There were also prizes for pilots that could fly from one point to another without touching the ground to refuel, or who could get from one area to another the quickest. But as World War I was looming ever closer, these inventors, engineers, and pilots would play a pivotal role in the design of prop plane fighters. Biplanes would become the dominating fighter before monoplanes. When World War I rolled in, aircraft were thought to have little or no importance in war. They were used as reconnaissance aircraft over the battlefield rather than fighting machines. As the war moved on, gradual changes to the aircraft were made, not only in the design, but in the weaponry. Airplanes started to be built with light metals instead of canvas and wood. Machine guns were mounted on the back of the planes as tail gunners. Eventually, a firing mechanism would allow the guns to be mounted on the front of the plane and fire through the propellers. Before this mechanism, sometimes propellers would be shot off by the firing machine guns, and this usually didn't end well for the pilot. These fighters had to become more maneuverable and have more powerful engines in order to stay on top. One German designer was fishing one day and was intrigued by the shape of the fish and noticed how they swam. He implemented the same body type of that fish into his fighter. The design worked considerably well as it helped aid in air flowing past the airplane more smoothly. These are just a few of the examples of things that changed aircraft during the war. As planes moved from reconnaissance to dogfighting, a new class of airplane was born. Generals and strategists needed a new airplane built for striking positions on the other side of enemy lines. Engineers began to design a new plane, one that could defend itself while dropping tons of bombs on the enemy fortifications and bases. The bomber was born. These airplanes had a large wingspan in order to maintain a large amount of lift. Most of them also had two engines in order to keep the plane airborne. But there was only so much that these bombers could do. Usually they required a fighter escort to keep them safe. Because, as great as these bombers were on paper, they were extremely vulnerable in the sky. When the smoke cleared over Europe after World War I, airplanes had come a long way. The need for advancement in the war had caused the design of aircraft to take a very large jump forward. During the years in between World War I and World War II, airplanes would find other uses. Aircraft engineers and designers realized that aircraft did not need multiple wings to stay airborne. They also had new and improved engines from fighters and bombers of World War I. So they began to put these planes to a new use. Passenger airlines were put into operation. A new company that is much more famous today arrived during this time period. Boeing was created just before the war ended to help the development of air combat. As its purpose died at the end of the war, it decided to take on the role of passenger aircraft. They used large monoplanes, usually with multiple engines. As they developed, they created a flying passenger boat called the Boeing 314. It could cover the large distance between San Francisco and Hong Kong. It was extremely helpful that it was a flying boat because this meant that if the airplane needed to land before it reached its destination, it could land on the Pacific rather than crashing into the water. Boeing was a leading discovery industry at its time as well, but there were other companies that also tried to begin passenger service. Douglas was one of these companies. Another company born just after the war ended. In 1936, they released one of their brand new aircraft to the line, the DC-3, a two-engine aircraft that used all of the new technology together into one plane. It was ideal in almost every aspect for not only civilian passengers, but also for transporting military personnel. It was designed with comfortable seats, a numerous amount of instruments, including autopilot. With a 95-foot wingspan and two engines, it could reach the maximum speed of 230 miles an hour. By 1939, the DC-3 was transporting 90% of the world's passengers. This airplane was one of the first passenger airplanes that made its company very profitable. But as another war loomed closer, Douglas, Boeing, and other aircraft companies would unknowingly play a pivotal role in the race to better fighters and bombers of World War II. As Germany fired the first shots of World War II in 1939, combat aircraft had been in little production, and each company started to quickly create new fighters in order to push back the Germans. Germany had been preparing for the war and outdid every country who tried to oppose it. The Germans had designed a new fighter named the Messerschmitt 109. It was very quick in a dive and had good maneuverability and a quick climb. The only plane that could fight it at the time was the British Hurricane. The Hurricane could not fight as well as the 109s, but it was the most aircraft the British military had at the time. But as seen in World War I, war pushes new ideas to their limits. and new inventions and designs were being tried all the time. Soon the British would have a new fighter, known as the Supermarine Spitfire. It was a very good match for the 109, and became the British mass-produced fighter. In America, though, they were slower on airplane design and in joining the war. Their primary fighter was the P-40 Warhawk. It was slower and less maneuverable than the 109s and Spitfires, but it could still fight, and since America was not in the war yet, there was no need for fighting. This all changed December 7th, 1941, when Pearl Harbor was bombed. America needed a new plane to fight its enemy in the Pacific, Japan. The Japanese had a new fighter alongside the Germans. The A6M-0, as it was called by both sides, was extremely maneuverable and could maintain a decent speed. It outclassed the German fighters with its maneuverability. America needed to replace another one of its aircraft, called the F-2A Buffalo. It was America's main naval plane, but laughably outclassed by the Zeros. United Aircraft and Transport was another company that before World War II worked with passenger aircraft. It worked with Boeing on a military aircraft throughout the war, but it was more keen on designing fighters rather than bombers. It designed a new fighter known as the F-4s Corsair, a heavy plane that surprised everyone with its speed and maneuverability, and was very capable of engaging Zeros and being able to outrun them in a tight spot. It was perfect for Americans' needs in the Pacific. But what about Europe? As Spitfires and 109s locked in combat above Europe, P-40s had a better chance in the fight, but were still outdated. A new aircraft approached the scene, the P-51 Mustang, a little late in the war, but exactly what America needed to fight in Europe with its powerful engine and quick maneuverability. It also had a new wing design that made it very fuel efficient. Even though fighters were widely needed, bombers also played an important role. The Germans had built a bomber called the Heinkel HE-111. That was perfect for quick raids on British cities and bases. Its downside, though, was its low defenses, but because Allied fighters were not able to get to the heavily defended HE-111s in time, the Germans were not concerned. The British put together a bomber that they had been working on and sent it into battle. It was the Avro Lancaster. Mainly used on night missions, it had low defenses, but usually had an escort. The British used it throughout the war and proved to be a very good bomber for its role. Boeing had put together a bomber for America just before the war. It was named the B-17 Flying Fortress. This bomber was mostly used in Europe during the day, with a powerful defense and huge bomb load. Even though it could defend itself during the day, it was still a prime target for anti-air fighters. It needed an escort, and the P-51s were on the job. As the war progressed, new development allowed aircraft to be faster, more maneuverable, and heavier. And a very important development that would allow pilots to be more comfortable with pressurized cabins. Used in every plane today, these cabins allowed aircraft to fly at higher altitudes, control temperature better, and funnel oxygen. Also, radar became very advanced and allowed autopilot to become more popular. As the war came to a close, one final aircraft that helped World War II to close quickly was the B-29 Superfortress by Boeing. It had every technological advancement and could fly extremely long distances, carrying a massive bomb load. Its defense was four 50 caliber remote-controlled turrets mounted below, above, behind, and in front of the plane. This was the plane that dropped the final bombs on Japan, including the 2 atomic bombs that ended the war. In Europe, the Germans had one last aircraft that could fight, the Messerschmitt Me 262, the first jet-engine plane to ever be mass-produced and in operation. Jet engines were being tested as early as 1935 and in 1941. The Me 262 prototypes were being created, but Hitler ordered it to be worked out as a bomber rather than a fighter, which delayed its arrival to the front until 1944, still as a fighter. Too late for it to make a difference in the war, but the beginning of a new era in aviation. Pilots protecting bombers that the Me-262s targeted were amazed by the astounding speed of the fighters. At around 540 miles per hour, it could easily cut through the defenses and shoot down multiple bombers before fighters could reach them. As for the effort, it would not win Germany the war. As World War II came to a close, the new technology of jet power was the next experimental project for every company and country around the world. The next jet on the scene was Britain's Gloster Meteor, the only Allied jet to see combat at the end of World War II. It was like the Me-262, but looked very different. The Me-262 looked more like a shark, while the Meteor looked more like a cross between the P-51 and a Spitfire. But they both had two engines and were very fast, and had the height of technological advancements. Prop planes were not out of the picture yet, though. Some planes were outfitted with an engine called a turboprop. It used the same concepts as a jet engine, but ran a propeller rather than a full jet engine. Even then, prop aircraft could not amount to the jet aircraft in the same way. As aircraft became faster, the new goal was to break the sound barrier. Not too long after the war, experiments and prototypes were tested to see how fast a jet fighter could go. The plane brought forward was the Bell X-1. With rocket booster engines but little fuel, the designers figured that they could carry the X-1 to a set altitude and use gravity and the thrust of the engines to hit Mach 1 and break the sound barrier. On October 14th, 1947, the X-1 was dropped from a B-29 at 12,000 feet. The aircraft accelerated to Mach 1.05, breaking the sound barrier and creating a new sound called the sonic boom. The X-1 then proceeded to slow down and land at the Muroc, California Air Base. As time went on, more wars spurred on technology advancement in aircraft. New aircraft and ideas were being tested constantly. America's F-86 Sabre was a dangerous opponent for Russia's MiG-17 during the Cold War and the Korean War. In Vietnam, the McDonnell Douglas F-4 Phantoms were designed for air-to-air missile combat, something that was brand new at the time. Also, some aircraft were able to refuel in the air by flying behind bombers that could pipe fuel into the subject aircraft, a method that is still used today. As weaponry such as missiles advanced and were put on aircraft, there was a need for pilots to learn how to fight in supersonic flight and use advanced weaponry. The Navy founded a special school to teach pilots these skills. It was named the Navy Fighter Weapons School in San Diego, California, also known by another name as Top Gun. Not only did the pilots learn new fighting skills, but they were also constantly competing to be on top of the class. This school is still in operation today. Radar systems also became very advanced, and were able to pick up almost any object in the sky. As a result, stealth aircraft were used for spying on an attacking enemy without being detected by radar. This was especially important in the Gulf Wars. A new aircraft, known as the F-117 Nighthawk, was able to attack enemy positions without being detected. Bomber aircraft were becoming somewhat obsolete at this point, mainly used for refueling other aircraft or quick bombing raids. Remote control missiles and homing missiles were used to neutralize targets from long distances away. Bombers are still used today, even if their roles differ from what they were during World War II. Fighters and attack aircraft are focused in our decade. Currently, the most advanced fighter jet that we know of is the F-22 Raptor, capable of reaching supersonic flight without using afterburners, and adjustable exhaust nozzles allow it to be super agile. A-10s are used in missions all over the world and ground attacks. With a large bomb and missile load, it is ideal for destroying armored units. Also, a 30mm rapid-fire gun is mounted at the front. As the need for military aircraft grew, so did passenger aircraft. Now with pressurized cabins and turbine engines, they quickly take passengers where they need to go more smoothly and comfortably. But there were still problems with some technological advancements that were not known, and some of them were found too late. One of these flaws was in the passenger plane known as the Comet. Built in the 1950s, it had all the comforts that an aircraft could have at the time for passengers, but an unknown structural weakness was caused by the pressurized cabin. Over time, as oxygen was pumped through the plane, the cabin became weak. After about 9,000 flying hours, the fuselage would split open and cause the cabin to explode. The Comet was permanently grounded, but this did not stop aviation pioneers. Boeing during this time were designing their own aircraft for passengers. They created a very large plane called the Boeing 707, an innovative aircraft at its time, but is no longer in service today. As there was more development in engines, the Boeing 747 was created, a very large aircraft that could transport almost 660 passengers. Later, Boeing built the Boeing 777, a twin-engine aircraft, smaller than the 747, that could hold 396 passengers at the most. Both the 777 and the 747 are used wisely today all over the world. Looking back on history, it has taken aviation about 120 years for it to reach its point in our era. From gliders to prop planes to jet and turbine engines, aviation has become part of everyday life. New ideas and tests for aircraft are being put on the spot every day. Development to make faster, comfortable, and safer aircraft are always on the minds of engineers, inventors, and designers. If the next 100 years look anything like the past 100 in development of aircraft, there is no telling where we might go.